This is not a joke. This is real. It's such a bunch of malarkey. Just the facts, ma'am, nothing but the facts. Oh, that was Joe Friday, actually.
We literally have a great show tonight. Donald J. Trump starts the week amid more questions about not just his chances of winning the White House, but also about the very viability he has as the GOP nominee. So he did what Donald Trump often does when facing doubts about his candidacy. He gave a scripted speech. Today, he was in Youngstown, Ohio, where he laid out more about his plans for combating terrorism at home and around the world. Trump called for a quick and complete eradication of ISIS, for finding common ground with Russia, and for a halt on issuing all visas in cases where sufficient background screenings are in doubt. And while continuously framing Hillary Clinton as weak on terrorism, Trump also proposed a political, ideological test for all immigrants coming into America. Here are some of the highlights from the speech.
Hillary Clinton lacks the judgment, as said by Bernie Sanders, stability and temperament, and the moral character to lead our nation. She also lacks the mental and physical stamina to take on ISIS. We should only admit into this country those who share our values and respect our people. The time is overdue to develop a new screening test for the threats we face today. I call it extreme vetting. In addition to screening out all members of the sympathizers of terrorist groups, we must also screen out any who have hostile attitudes toward our country or its principles, or who believe that Sharia law should supplant American law. Those who do not believe in our Constitution or who support bigotry and hatred will not be admitted for immigration into our country. To put these new procedures in place, we will have to temporarily suspend immigration from some of the most dangerous and volatile regions of the world that have a history of exporting terrorism. The support networks for radical Islam in this country will be stripped out and removed one by one, viciously if necessary. Those who are guests in our country that are preaching hate will be asked to return home immediately, and if they don't do it, we will return them home.
So, Donnie, what he unveiled today, as we always ask, is it good policy and is it good politics?
Let's talk about the policy. There's one, he wants to have this extreme vetting. Let's do a little role play here. You're in Ellis Island, and you ask me the question.
I sense your skepticism.
Yes, you say, Donnie, would you, or whatever my name is, do you believe in Sharia law as opposed to American law?
No.
No. Okay, thank you very much. You're into our country. So there's a little silliness to it. The thing I found interesting is he was in the we're getting out of the nation-building business, which is ironic because the very reason he called Barack Obama the founder of ISIS last week was because Obama was basically getting out of the nation-building business, was pulling our troops out of Iraq. So there's a certain contradiction there. I find it interesting that he talked that Hillary Clinton doesn't have the physical stamina. Is that because she's a woman? Is that because they're going to start to put all the stroke stuff out there, that she's not, physically up to the task? I thought that was a gender thing. None of this matters, though. None of this matters. Just like his economic speech last week, this was solid. It was meat and potatoes. That's not his problem. Policy is not going to decide at this point. Temperament. And now he's using the temperament word in his thing. 56-31. He is not fit to be president until that changes. He's not going to do it on policy.
I think that the policy stuff, saying you're going to have this special test, I agree with you. Logistically, it's complicated. But I do think Americans would like to see a better system for keeping people out of the country.
Absolutely.
And this is an opening bid, at least on that. On alliances around the world, I think that is relatively good politics, and I'm not sure it's horrible policy to say we're going to need to ally with people who share our interests as kind of realism. Again, Trump is trying to tap into dissatisfaction with how things are going, how people are feeling about the war against ISIS. Even though President Obama's marks are up, I think in general people are nervous about it. So I think today was fine. The problem is, as you said, one, this isn't his current problem, and two, I don't know that he can sustain it. He did not seem, to my ear and eye, to be particularly engaged with this topic today. He did not seem to be giving this speech with gusto. And once again, it was a little bit dark. Americans want to know we're going to win with optimism, not just face a lifetime of very tough choices overseas.
He's never engaged when he's going off script. It was the same. This was the identical. This was the twin pillar of the economic.
You mean on script?
I mean, when he's on script. This was the twin pillar to the economic. It was solid, meat and potatoes, but it's not in his eyes when he's not going off script. Okay.
He should have practiced it more, I think.
Last week was a rough one for Donald Trump when it came to how he's polling in battleground states. This week is certainly not starting much better. A new CBS poll in Florida has Hillary Clinton up by 5 points, 45 to 40%. Another CBS survey in New Hampshire, a state Trump once listed among his strongest swing states, has him now down 9 points, 45 to 36%. And Georgia, a typically red state that Democrats have been salivating over for years, looks now like a competitive race. Trump leads there 45 to 41, but it's within the poll's margin of error. All of this has various news organizations crunching the numbers and predicting a big electoral college win for Clinton. And even the Wall Street Journal is raising alarm that the Republican nominee might need to be replaced, and soon. The paper's editorial board wrote, quote, if they can't get Mr. Trump to change his act by Labor Day, the GOP will have no choice but to write off the nominee as hopeless and focus on salvaging the Senate and House and other down-ballot races. As for Mr. Trump, he needs to stop blaming everyone else and decide if he wants to behave like someone who wants to be president or turn the nomination over to Mike Pence. We're more than a month away, and the debates and the early voting starts in October. Mark, it's clear now that the National Republicans are willing to dump Trump under certain circumstances. What do you think is the actual deadline for something like this to happen?
I had thought until this past week that they were going to give him till the first debate. I'm now hearing skepticism from Republicans. You know, the debate schedule's up in the air. It's currently not scheduled to start until late September. If Trump, I don't think anybody thinks Hillary Clinton's going to come into that debate unprepared. The chances that Trump turns everything around on the strength of a debate in late September seems pretty remote to a lot of people I'm talking to. I don't think they're going to give him to the first debate anymore. I think that if he doesn't turn it sooner, you're going to see pressure. Now, Republicans at the RNC say, well, Trump's raising all our money. There are a lot of donors who aren't giving right now who will give. Is it a net dollar-for-dollar change? No. But if his numbers haven't improved by shortly after Labor Day, I believe there will be a strong push whose chances are possible to succeed that they abandon him the way Bob Dole was abandoned.
I agree with you. Politico wrote an interesting story that no president or no candidate has had numbers like he's had and has won the popular vote in the history of taking this down. So it is very bad. I actually believe something else is going to start to happen in the next few weeks if things don't turn around. And I said this a while ago and then I turned around, but I'm coming back to it. I could actually see Trump bailing. I can't see us ever getting to the point where election night Trump becomes George McGovern. He is not going to allow it. It's just not in his system. It's very interesting. I spoke to a Clinton staffer who said the thing they're most afraid of, and there's a date, I think it was September 15th, where they can't put somebody else in, is him bailing out and Mitt Romney coming or something. I see him dropping the mic and going, here's his speech. You know, I got to do what's best for the country.
Manhattan fantasy. He's not going to drop out before the first debate. He thinks he can win it at the first.
My point is drop out at some point. I cannot see him. I cannot see him with the rest of his life with this big L on his head.
The battleground states. Early voting basically starts everywhere in October. Obviously, Ohio, October 4th. You can't just turn things around on October 4th. You got to turn around in the run-up to October 4th.
He could do whatever the hell he wants.
Well, but I'm saying in terms of the party abandoning him. He's not going to drop out.
You're talking about the party abandoning. It is not beyond, and I've heard this from some people also who know him.
Fantasy.
Well, I'm a Manhattan guy, so I like to fantasize.
He's staying in, but he may be doing it under a lot of headwinds unless he can turn things around quick, which he can do. Now is the time, and with all due respect, when we cut the malarkey. Hillary Clinton got a little help from her old friend Joe Biden today in the vice president's hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania. That's, of course, the same town where her family has deep roots. There was a bevy of Biden classics on offer throughout the day, including a slightly awkward tarmac hug that kept going and going and going. Release, Joe, release. There was also, release. There was also some of Biden's usual folksy banter.
Good to be home with so many friends as I look around. Matter of fact, one of the people on the reception line said, my aunt owns your house. Tell her I'm coming. I'm coming home. I was there when I was running, and up in the bedroom, written on the wall still is, Joe Biden slept here. And then it said, lived here. I'm glad they added the lived here part.
As with every Biden event, though, it wasn't just humor. There were also a lot of moments of high emotion.
If my son were still in Iraq, And I say to all those who are there, the threat to their life has gone up a couple clicks. It's gone up a couple clicks. You saw what's happening in Turkey, where some in Turkey are accusing us of being part of the coup attempt. Ladies and gentlemen, does he have any idea the adverse consequence these outlandish comments have on our allies, our friends, and the physical safety of our troops? This guy doesn't care about the middle class. And I don't even blame him in a sense, because he doesn't understand it. He doesn't have a clue. And what Hillary's all about is making sure that every one of you can look your child and your grandchild in the eye and say, honey, I mean this sincerely, everything's going to be okay. Hillary understands that the most damaging thing to a parent is to look at a talented child or a sick child or a child in need and not be able to do anything.
A lot of good Joe Biden there. Great talker. Wants Clinton elected. So, Donnie, what can Biden do between now and Election Day to help Hillary Clinton besides, we always talk about this, appeal to white working class voters in Pennsylvania and other battleground states?
What you saw there on display is his brand, and he's, as far as I'm concerned, everybody's favorite uncle, where he puts his arm around you, you trust him, he'll have a beer with you. And I think that cuts across party lines. I think he laid out, when he talked about his son, that he would throw himself before he would let his late son, who was a vet, go over there, and talked about parenting, and talked about everything's going to be okay. He will continue to be the surrogate to let people know things might not be okay with Trump as commander-in-chief. That will be his message. It'll be done in a folksy way. And yes, he'll be talking the Rust Belt. Yes, he'll be talking about economy. But that's the uncle that puts his arm around and says, guys, we can't do this.
I totally agree with you. This national security thing is a big deal. Not everybody is going to have their heartstring tugged when he talks about Joe Biden, but a lot of Democrats will, a lot of military families will. And he has got credibility on that issue. None of the other big surrogates can speak with that kind of authority. So yes, blue-collar economics, but also national security and national security experience. Now, Republicans will often say Joe Biden's been wrong about a lot of stuff on national security, but in the context of September, October rallies, campaigning, robocalls, fundraising events, she's got Obama, she's got her husband, President Obama, but she's got another big surrogate in Joe Biden.
I picture her with the football, and she's got these pulling guards in front of her. She's got Biden, she's got Michelle Obama, she's got Barack Obama, she's got Bernie Sanders, she's got Elizabeth Warren, who can all pick and plumb. And who does Trump have running in front of him? Rudy Giuliani? I mean, he does not. Mike Huckabee, exactly.
Big blocker.
Yeah.
All right, up next, there is a big scandal war underway. What both presidential campaigns are saying about the other side and whether anything's going to stick. That when we come back. Both major presidential campaigns say they want this election to be fought out over the issues, but they're both also spending a lot of time trying to get the media interested in controversies about their rivals. Lately, the Trump campaign has been expressing outrage that some Clinton-related stories aren't getting more coverage. Among them, reports that an allegedly under-credentialed Clinton Foundation donor was appointed at the insistence of Clinton's State Department staff to a highly sensitive board that advises the Secretary of State on nuclear security. We're also this week expect to see more emails from longtime Clinton aide Huma Abedin in the coming days, whose status as a, quote, special government employee while Clinton was Secretary of State is still under scrutiny, along with her ties to the Clinton Foundation. And the FBI is preparing to give Congress notes from its investigations of Clinton's emails, along with a summary of the evidence that they uncovered during that probe. So, Donnie, will these controversies, these flaps, these contretemps, will they get more coverage, and should any of them get more coverage?
Yes and yes, but here's the only way it makes a difference. Until you can draw a straight line, not a quid pro quo, this person got a job or this, to the foundation taking money, and because of the money, it affected her decision-making as Secretary of State as far as policy. Until that line is drawn, this all goes into a blur. It's not an appointment here, an appointment there. Other than that, it goes into what we talked about last week, that murky, mushy box. Yeah. And it's also more of the same. We already know Hillary Clinton doesn't tell the truth, is a politician, plays quid pro quo. We know that. It's baked in.
I think the thing that would break through, they should all get more scrutiny, and the press really needs to ask itself whether it's disregarding things because they're old. That plays right into what the Clintons always wanted to spin, which is this is an old scandal. But the thing is, they've got to show that she made decisions, or her State Department made decisions under her authority that were against the government interest, the public interest,
exactly,
in order to help a donor.
Exactly.
And some of these things may be edging in that direction, but no one has proven that exact linkage in a way in any of these new controversies. It will be interesting to see the evidence from the investigation into the email, see what they have.
Okay, now here's a story the Clinton side is pushing today. The New York Times is reporting that an anti-corruption investigation in Ukraine has uncovered a secret record that appears to catalog more than $12 million in unseemly or perhaps illegal cash payments made by the country's pro-Russian political party to Donald Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, between 2007 and 2012. Manafort's ties to Russian and Ukrainian interests had been previously reported, but the new claims provide fresh fodder for opponents who've been raising questions about the political consulting work he has done abroad. Last night, shortly after the story posted, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, Robbie Mook, put out a statement that read in part, quote, Donald Trump has responsibility to disclose campaign chair Paul Manafort's and all other campaign employees and advisors ties to Russian or pro-Kremlin entities, including whether Trump or any of Trump's employees or advisors are currently representing or being paid by them. Manafort issued his own response to the report, quote, the suggestion that I accepted cash payments is unfounded, silly, and nonsensical. There is no evidence of cash payments made to me by any official in Ukraine. Mark, same question you asked me, should this get more coverage, and is anything here going to stay?
It should get coverage. I mean, look, lots of people who work at senior levels of campaigns make money, including overseas. It's normally not an issue. In this case, the New York Times story, I think, is a little bit soft in the sense that there's no proof. They've seen ledgers, handwritten ledgers. There's no other evidence that I read in that story. But Trump has made a big deal about ties to Russia. He said a lot of controversial things about Ukraine, about the relationship between the three countries. So it's going to get scrutiny, and it should.
Yeah, I would say this is an automatic who cares because he's a political operative. They're paid guns, except to your point, I agree with. There's just been too much Putin, Trump, Russia, buddies, we're going to go after terrorists together, and now all of a sudden this operative is in there. So it just kind of has got a yuck feel to it, but I don't think anything is going to stick. I put it in the same box that the Hillary box is in.
What Trump has said about sort of alliances with Russia, it's not so different than the current administration policy. We have alliances with Russia all over the world. His failure to repudiate the worst aspects of Putinism, I think, brings this kind of scrutiny, not just on him, but on Paul Manafort and anyone else around him. But as with everybody, the presumption should be there's nothing here until there's more evidence. And like I said, the Times story was interesting, but it didn't prove that he got any money. And we know he got paid money while he was working in that part of the world. Needs to be more investigation. All right, when we come back, we will have Trump's senior advisor, Boris Epshteyn, here on set to talk about Trump's speech today and more right after these words from our sponsors. always lots to talk about in Trump world, so let's get right to it with our next guest. It's Boris Epstein, a senior advisor to the Trump campaign. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
What is the state of the Trump campaign? How are things going, would you say?
The state is strong. 85 days to go. The candidate, obviously, as you saw in the speech today, is focused on national security, on the economy, on driving the message. So there's a lot of sideshow stories out there, but overall, we're very confident within the campaign, and that's no spin. Yeah. Very confident.
I've heard people around Mr. Trump say for a while it's his to lose. Do you still think that's the case?
I think it's ours to win. Yeah. I think it's.
But is he the favorite or the underdog? The polls suggest he's an underdog.
I'd say at this point in time, if Americans look at the two options, it's a binary option. Trump's the favorite.
I want to give you a theory and say hello to all the folks at the Trump up there.
I will do, and they say hello as well.
I believe Trump has 9 deadly sins, listing all the things he's done, and said we don't have to go through all of them, the emails and the cons and whatnot. I'm a firm believer, and he gave a solid speech today, unless somehow he walks them back and says, you know what, I was doing this for a reason, to create attention, and I want to apologize to cans. I think those deadly sins stick with him. I do not believe he can just go forward without taking 2 steps back. Tell me if I'm right or wrong.
This is my 3rd campaign. Unfortunately, the first 2 are losers. I was on McCain, I was on Romney. I respect both men immensely. From experience, I'll tell you that going back and relitigating old issues never works, 1. 2, he's not going to do it because he wasn't wrong in any one of those. But we could talk about that. You know, we could disagree. Reasonable people can't.
Then he's not going to win the election.
But going forward, driving the message home of national security and the economy, and the 3rd issue being national security and the economy, he will win the election.
Not enough now. That would have been a month ago.
70% of people in this country, Donnie, feel the country is going in the wrong direction. 70%, that's a huge number. Almost that number, if not more, feel we're less safe now than we were 8 years ago. So why would those people, 70% of those people, give 4 more years to Clinton Obama? It just doesn't make any sense.
It makes complete sense because they feel he's dangerous. It's very simple. The numbers tell you that.
What does Donald Trump think of Vladimir Putin?
You'd have to ask Donald Trump. But I think in his speech today, he made it very clear that Russia is an entity, is a country that could be used in a fight against Syria. He's also been tough on Russia at other points. But
do you think Putin's a bad guy or a good guy?
You'd have to ask Donald Trump.
All right. You live in New York?
I do.
Yeah. Donald Trump said for a long time he was going to win New York. New poll shows him down 30. Is Donald Trump still going to win New York?
85 days left.
So he still could win New York?
Absolutely. Every state's in play.
Every
state's in play. That doesn't mean that the campaign's going to concentrate in every state, but every state's in play 85 days out.
Explain. You like his chances in New York?
I like his chances overall to win the presidency. Is New York going to be a challenge? Potentially, but can we win New York? Absolutely.
See, I think you guys lose credibility by not saying, you know what, we've made mistakes here, and New York is not in play. People are not stupid, you know. When they see numbers like 50 to 25, when they see those polling numbers, you can't just all of a sudden say the polls are not right when he ran on the polls to get elected. There's got to be some turn somewhere. You can't just keep saying things are okay, things are going in our direction, because they're not.
Well, Donnie, what I'm saying is this, is that in my answer on New York, I'm saying New York is a state that 85 days out, we're not going to write off, 1. Overall, as far as the national polls go, the LA Times has us within 1 point. The Bloomberg Reuters points within 5 or 6. That's a very close. And, you know, this is the dog days of summer, right? Everything's going to tighten, and American people will make up their minds in September, October, and very much in November. There's 3 debates coming up, and we are very confident Donald Trump will deliver the message that he's much stronger than Hillary Clinton on national security and the economy. And then you have to go back to who Hillary Clinton is as a candidate, right? She's somebody who's failed throughout her career in private practice, failed in a Hillary care, an inconsequential senator, and one of the worst secretaries of state, if not the worst, this country's ever seen. Look all over the world. We're worse off now than we were when she became Secretary of State. She failed that tryout.
All right, we got a lot more to talk about with you, so sit tight, Boris. When we come back, we're going to continue the conversation, add some more people in right after this.
a stunning ignoramus on foreign policy issues and national security.
I have no doubt that Putin thinks that he's an unwitting agent of the Russian Federation.
This is not somebody who should be handed the nuclear codes.
What is the time frame between his decision and when the nuclear weapons are launched?
Joe, it's scenario dependent, but the system is designed for speed and decisiveness.
That was just a new bit of web video out today from the Clinton campaign, which features some prominent Republicans questioning Trump's foreign policy chops. Boris Epstein, a senior advisor to Donald Trump, is still with us. Also in studio is Tim Miller, who is the co-founder of America Rising PAC and former communications director for Jeb Bush's campaign. And joining us from D.C., chief strategist for the pro-Clinton super PAC, Priorities USA, Guy Cecil. Guy, let me start with you. Guy, some more funky news today out about Hillary and some appointments. Every day it's emails. Every day it's foundation. It's clink, 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 clink. When does that kind of glass break? At some point?
No, I think the facts are that as we've moved through this entire process from the partisan Republican committee reviews of Benghazi through multiple looks at the emails from the State Department through the FBI director's press conference, we arrive really at the same conclusions, which is that Hillary Clinton apologized for using her own server. But at the end of the day, what you said is exactly right. There continues to be new information, but nothing really new in terms of how she performed as Secretary of State. And certainly in an election between two people, when you compare what's being said about Hillary Clinton compared to what Donald Trump said today in his speech, there really is no contest on who is actually prepared to be commander-in-chief. And that's why Republican senators, former CIA directors, leaders in the military have pretty consistently and almost unanimously said that Donald Trump is unfit to be president of the United States.
Tim, you're not supporting Trump. Are you supporting anyone in this race?
Not supporting anyone in this race. Trump is by far the worst option, though. And so I hate to agree with Guy because, look, Hillary has given the Republicans so many opportunities here, both on foreign policy, where we could have had a nominee giving a speech today that made a credible critique of her State Department record, or we could have had a nominee that is not a pathological liar who could have criticized her about her lying with regards to the emails. But we don't. We're stuck with Donald Trump. And I thought his speech today was completely out of step with where Republicans should be on foreign policy and the post-World War II consensus. I actually think he's the worst nominee on foreign policy of either party since World War II.
Of all these Clinton controversies that are out there, which one do you think is most likely to catch a spark with voters if correctly publicized by the Trump campaign and the Republicans?
Well, Trump's not going to correctly publicize it, so it doesn't really matter. I think that the email scandal is probably the one that's the most damaging, in addition to her just disastrous tenure as Secretary of State overall, more than any specific scandal. But look, Donald Trump is not capable of litigating this case. Boris might be able to, but Trump can't.
I know there's great frustration in the Trump campaign, saying what it sees as unequal coverage of controversies involving the two sides. The press does not have a great history of being super friendly to the Clintons. Why would it be that the media wouldn't be covering Clinton controversies as much as it always has?
Well, you'd have to ask the press. But
well, what's your theory, though?
I don't have a theory. All I want to do is win an election. That's 85 days from now. I don't spend time theorizing why the press covers something or doesn't. But the case in point is, just over the last week, you've had 44 more emails come out that Hillary Clinton did not turn over, even though she said she did. She perjured herself in front of Congress when she said that all pertinent emails were turned over. That was perjury, okay? Three FBI field offices wanted to pursue some sort of indictment against the Clinton Foundation, but the DOJ, the Department of Justice, run by Loretta Lynch, a lifetime friend of the Clintons, clamped that down. These are huge issues. And let's not forget about Gilbert Chagoury, the Lebanese-Nigerian businessman, gave $1 billion, with a B, $1 billion to the Clinton Global Initiative, and then asked for favors in return, which she probably received.
Boris, we're hearing about a lot of infighting in the campaign, and Trump is not used to being a loser, and that he's cranky, and he's exhausted, and he's kind of frustrated because he wants to do what he was doing during the primary season. How's the man? How's the guy? How's his head?
I will tell you for a fact, as of this morning, that this is a candidate who's 100% focused on winning, who is 100% energized, and is fully set on going through the next 85 days and winning this election. And as far as the infighting, that's incorrect. The campaign is focused. The campaign is united.
Who's running the campaign?
Paul Manafort is the chairman of the campaign, but the campaign is overall, listen, Donald Trump is the candidate.
If he's going to make one call at the end of the night, what do I do tomorrow morning? in your opinion, who's that one call he makes?
That's up to Donald Trump who to make the call to.
Special correspondent Tim Miller, you got a question for Boris?
Oh, you have a question? I love this.
Do I have a question
Yeah.
for us?
Yeah,
Well, I didn't have one off the top of my head, but watching the last segment, I'm just curious. Boris is living on Earth 2, where Donald Trump, he thinks, has a chance to win New York and Connecticut. So my question is, do you think that Donald Trump should spend a single cent in New York or Connecticut between now and November?
Well, as far as Connecticut goes, going to Connecticut on Saturday was a great play. Hillary Clinton was down for 2 days, maybe napping, who knows. But Donald Trump was in Connecticut, gave a great rally, but that rally was covered all over the country. It was on all the networks. So that was a positive. So as far as spending money in Connecticut and New York, if that A, puts you in a position to potentially win, but B, gets you coverage all over the country, of course, spend the money.
Guy, what do you think of the forays into Connecticut?
Oh, I would strongly encourage Boris to spend a significant amount of money in New York and Connecticut. I think that is a terrific strategy on the part of the Trump campaign. It shows that they are forward-thinking, and I think it is a terrific idea.
Trumpian
sarcasm,
Trumpian sarcasm. I can tell from the way he's turning up the corners of his.
That's how you actually do
Hillary Clinton all weekend long.
learning from the very best.
Guy, we got less than a minute left. Do you have a question for Boris?
Do I get to ask questions?
Yeah.
I mean, I would just like to know, if this is Donald Trump focused 100% on winning, what would Donald Trump focused 50% on winning look like? Because today he's losing every single
like Hillary Clinton.
That was a rhetorical
We're gonna
question.
find out.
Quickly, we got less than a minute. Got a quick question for one of these two
What
guys?
was Hillary Clinton doing all weekend? Why wasn't she out there trying to woo voters?
Guys in the super PAC, he's not allowed to know.
Right, of course he knows.
Sorry.
She was. I'll tell you where she was. She was in the Hamptons.
No, last 2 days, Saturday, Sunday. Nobody knows. Nobody where she is. Bottom line is, again, 85 days. The American people have a binary choice. I know Tim says he doesn't have a candidate in the race, but there are only 2 candidates in this race. You have choice between somebody who's a lifelong liar and a failure, Hillary Clinton, and who's a lifelong success.
We got to break
and
it
will be
here.
a great president, Donald
We got to
Trump.
break it here. I'm sorry people can't see your socks. Boris Epstein, thank you for coming on the show. Tim Miller, Guy Cecil, stick around. We'll be right back with more.
We are back. Here with us in studio, Tim Miller is co-founder of the Super PAC America Rising, former communications director of Jeb Bush's presidential campaign, and an avowed anti-Trumper, one of America's leading anti-Trumpers, I feel comfortable saying. And in Washington, Guy Cecil, the chief strategist for the pro-Clinton Super PAC Priorities USA. Guy, as we were coming on the air, we were working on some reporting that I wasn't able to finish up on, so I'm hoping you can help us out. A source familiar with the buying for your Super PAC says that you're scaling back in 3 states, in Virginia, where you'd already scaled back your buy. And then in Colorado and Pennsylvania, 3 states that public polls show Hillary Clinton way ahead. Is it true that your super PAC is scaling back your buying in those states?
We are, and as you know, we're constantly making assessments about how to make sure we're spending our money efficiently and effectively. It's why we expanded our campaign into North Carolina. We're looking at other states as well. But as of right now, we are significantly reducing our spending in those 3 states.
And you're reducing, just to be clear, because you think her lead there is big enough that you don't need to be on the air there.
That's correct. I mean, I do think we're constantly assessing where we are. We take this sort of on a week-by-week basis. We're not taking anything for granted. We know that Virginia and Colorado and Pennsylvania have been relatively close elections over the course of the last 2 or 3 cycles. But for right now, we're going to look at other opportunities for us to expand the map and potentially to reach out to some new voters as well through voter registration and on-the-ground efforts in some of our key states.
So again, my understanding is this reduction and going off the air in those states goes through about September 20th. That's a couple-week period. Are you banking that money and saving it for later dates, or are you moving it to other states?
We're going to be moving it both to other states, but also into other activities. You know, one of the things about the work that we've been doing is we're not just focusing on persuadable swing voters in the suburbs. We think it's actually really critical to use this opportunity to expand our party, to increase registration and turnout amongst key Democratic constituencies like Hispanics, African Americans, younger voters, unmarried women. And so we're going to be looking for opportunities in places like Florida in places like Ohio to begin doing work on the ground with registration and turnout. So it'll be some combination of both of those things. We don't expect on making any changes to our current map before Labor Day.
This is actually critical, as it needs to be a wake-up call to the Republican Party. Despite Boris thinking that Donald Trump could win New York, like the presidential race is over. And right now, Hillary Clinton plus Guy's super PAC has $15 million on the air in North Carolina. And as Guy just said, they're looking to register voters there and bring out voters. We have a competitive Senate race in North Carolina. Donald Trump has not a single cent on TV in North Carolina, and it's absolutely critical that all of the Republican groups start to focus their efforts on going to states like North Carolina, trying to save people like Richard Burr so that we can have a check on President Hillary Clinton.
Tim, you were Jeb's communication director. Obviously, different game when there were 16 people. You see such a flawed candidate at this point. Woulda, coulda, shoulda. What would you do over to do differently?
I think the Republican electorate, it was not the right year for a candidate like Jeb. And if you look at Jeb, Marco, Kasich, the 3 candidates, or even throw in Christie, 4 candidates who are talking about expanding the party, having an optimistic vision for the future, they got about 1/3 of the vote, less than 1/3 of the vote. So, you know, it's not like, boy, had we had one zinger right in a debate, it would have been different. Sure, there are things we would have done differently, but the party was not in a place for it this year. I do think if Ted Cruz was the nominee, and that's why as soon as Jeb dropped out, I immediately started working for an anti-Trump PAC, Ted Cruz would at least be in a competitive race with Guy and with Hillary Clinton right now. We wouldn't be in this place. They'd still have to at least have ads up in Colorado and Virginia, but unfortunately that's not the case, and right now we need to stave off a landslide.
Guy, Tim says the race is over, the presidential race is over. Do you agree with that?
No. I mean, it is still August. We have
You're not on the air in Virginia.
85 days.
You agree with that. You can just say it. You're not on the air in Virginia. Like, the race is over if you're not on the air in Virginia. Come on.
Yeah, no, actually, I don't think that's true. I do think we have to stay focused in places like Florida and Ohio, places like New Hampshire, not only because we have the presidential race there, which is going to be determinative of whether we win or lose the presidency, but also because of critical Senate states around the country. It's important not only that Hillary Clinton is inaugurated, but that she has a Senate that she can work with, that has the same values, that shares the same values as we Democrats, independents, and fair-minded Republicans. So I don't think it's over. I think we're going to stay very focused on the prize all the way through the end of the election.
Guy, could you imagine a scenario where if Republicans start diverting money away from the top of the ticket, that you all might start spending money on Senate races?
I think we're constantly looking at all of the options out there. I don't think it's something we would rule out, but right now, our focus is on making sure Hillary Clinton not only wins, but wins in as many places and among as many people as possible. We think that will not only benefit Hillary, but it will benefit Democrats up and down the ticket.
Guy, there are a lot of Bernie supporters. Obviously, she's got the majority now, but starting to get very squeamish as she starts to edge a little bit towards the center. There was an article comparing her to Mitt Romney, kind of one and the same. Are you concerned that any of those people could be in play if she moves too much further to the center?
Well, I would disagree that she is somehow moving since the primary. She's still out there talking about raising wages, creating jobs, criminal justice reform, voting rights reform, supporting the LGBT community, an aggressive diplomatic foreign policy. So I think that's a misread of, she's still talking about TPP. I think it's a fundamental misread of what she's been talking about. And I think it's incumbent upon every single Hillary Clinton supporter to reach out to Bernie Sanders supporters, most of which we are currently getting. If you look at most polls, we're at 85, 90%. But we want to make sure we extend open arms to every Bernie supporter and let them know that the things that we care about together are only going to be achieved not with a vote for Donald Trump or Jill Stein, not by sitting out this election, by supporting Hillary Clinton in November, and that's something we intend to be focused on.
You've worked with the Republican National Committee. We talked earlier about this prospect of shifting resources away from the top of the ticket. Who could make that happen? What would have to happen? Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, Reince Priebus?
Yeah, look, it has to be a group effort, and I think that part of it comes from, donor requests focusing on money to the NRSC and NRCC, which I think has started to happen. And look, I think that, Reince working together with McConnell, with Ryan, with the NRSC and NRCC need to make that call. You can do it in not a big poking your finger in Trump's eye sort of way, at least to start. And that's talking about let's shift to turnout resources in states like Ohio, North Carolina, that are already competitive states. Focus more about that, because I think that there's a legitimate concern about Republicans, particularly suburban Republicans, just not showing up to vote in presidential states that also have Senate race, Colorado, for example.
You and Jeb Bush, who you worked for, were warned a broad array of traits of Trump's that you thought would be a problem winning a general election. In what ways, if any, has he been worse as a general election candidate than you thought he would be?
He's been exactly the general election candidate that I thought he'd be. We said all last year, I think before Christmas last year, we put out a web video from Jeb's campaign that said nominating Donald Trump would mean Hillary Clinton's inauguration. We had a big fake Hillary inauguration video. And then as part of Never Trump, I predicted back in April that he could lose South Carolina, Utah, Missouri, and Georgia, and Arizona. And I think those right now are the toss-up states. And when Guy talks about expanding the map and expanding the party, you'll have him on in a month, and he'll talk about Arizona.
I want to promise you come back, because my partner here called me a Manhattan fantasizer, because I said Donald Trump is not going to allow himself to be George McGovern. There's a story to be written here. He's not going to be sitting here election night losing 46
Here's what I agree with you. I think I wouldn't be surprised to see him quit the campaign trail for a couple of days. It's hard. Mark, you know this. 85 days is hard. I'm not saying he drops out of the race or some fantasy where Mike Pence is the candidate.
Something's going to happen.
But look, 85 days, waking up every morning. I did this with Jeb, where the numbers are looking worse and worse. It is tough. And guys like Jeb have the integrity and the dignity to put on a happy face and run an honorable campaign.
He's never played
that is not Donald Trump.
Ever.
So
it's the man. You got to understand the man.
I think that he's going to act out.
All right, Tim Miller, Guy Cecil, thank you both. Happy to have you on always. Next, we're going to head to Scranton, PA for a dispatch from the campaign trail. If you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can listen to this program on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
us now, NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Walker, who's in Scranton, Pennsylvania, today covering Hillary Clinton's rally with Vice President Joe Biden. Kristen, we saw a lot of the tape. It was interesting. Your colleague Katie Tur was on last week, and I said, tell me, what do you feel when you're in those rallies? Do you feel the hatred that sometimes you see? Tell me about what you feel, what you felt out there today, not what Biden said, the vibe in the crowd.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It felt a lot like a homecoming. This is, of course, his hometown. And this is, of course, Biden's element. It's Biden being Biden, not only being on that stage and getting the crowd all riled up, but also just afterwards, those moments when he's shaking hands, pressing the flesh. That's when he makes a big difference in these critical swing areas like Scranton. And of course, Pennsylvania right now, Secretary Clinton has a pretty hefty lead, but clearly the campaign not taking that for granted. And they're hoping that an appearance by Biden here will also help in neighboring Ohio. Of course, that's also a critical battleground state. A lot of white working class, blue collar voters who live in these regions that are really going to make a difference in this race. But he was on fire today. He really slammed Donald Trump, called him the most unprepared candidate in history when it comes to foreign policy. And he ticked off a number of reasons why, including the fact that he said President Obama founded ISIS and the fact that he has praised leaders like Putin and Saddam Hussein. But it was really those moments, those one-to-one interactions that he had that I think makes a big difference in these types of areas.
You've been following the Secretary of State around for a while. She seems to be getting looser. Obviously, the numbers, the wind at her back. I'm feeling a kind of just a certain comfortableness in her own skin that I haven't seen before.
I think you have started to see that both after she's kind of had these big wins during the primary. You started to see her get more and more comfortable. And then you're absolutely right in these types of campaign events. And again, it's in those moments when she's having one-on-one interactions with the crowd and kind of feeding off of that energy. But of course, you're reminded when Biden takes the stage of someone who really relishes doing that. And I think Secretary Clinton is growing increasingly to enjoy doing that more. And it's something that voters are responding to. Remember, that has been a big challenge for her in this campaign, winning over voters. That's part of gaining their trust, and she still does struggle with those trust issues. Biden, of course, an important character witness for her. He talked a lot about what it was like to work with her when she was Secretary of State during the Obama administration, and they're hoping that those types of character witness statements coming from the vice president and the president himself will help her with that deficit that she has with voters' trust.
It's extraordinarily unusual for the FBI to ever release investigative data. Yep. It almost never has happened in my experience covering Washington and the FBI. They plan to do it apparently in the case of Hillary Clinton. Is the Clinton campaign objecting to that and asking why they're being subject to unusual treatment, or are they welcoming it?
Let me tell you where that stands right now. They object to what are known as the 302s, the notes from Secretary Clinton's FBI interviews just being released to select lawmakers. Their argument is if you are going to release those notes, release them to the public. The reason why Clinton campaign officials say if you just release them to lawmakers, they are subject then to just have portions of them, select portions leaked out. And that's what they're concerned about, that they could be used as a political weapon without the public really seeing the broader context. Very important to note that these are not the transcripts, they are the notes. Republican lawmakers have really been ramping up the pressure on the FBI to release them. Director James Comey has indicated that that's something that he wants to do. I will tell you that we learned today that the State Department is holding up the process. They're saying, hey, wait a minute, before any of this is released, we want to review it. So that's where the discussions stand right now. So no timeline yet on when or if these notes are actually going to be released. But you're absolutely right. This is something that is incredibly rare, and the Clinton campaign taking issue with that as well, saying that it's clearly political, that it's being done so quickly.
All right, Kristen, we got to go.
Guys.
Thank you so much. Kristen Welker, we will be right back.
You can head to BloombergPolitics.com right now and read a story by Ben Brody and Nick Wadham about the many hats that Clinton aide Huma Abedin has worn during her tenure as an advisor to the Secretary of State, and all the scrutiny she's under right now because of it. Coming up on Bloomberg TV, Bloomberg West has Atomico CEO Nicholas Zenstrom. Until tomorrow, Donnie will be right here. Thanks for watching. Sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's begin with a check of your first word news. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump today delivered a national security address in Youngstown, Ohio. Trump said a new mindset's needed to take on what he called, quote, the ideology of radical Islam. He said that Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton isn't up to the job.
Incident after incident proves again and again Hillary Clinton lacks the judgment, as said by Bernie Sanders, stability and temperament, and the moral character to lead our nation.
Mrs. Clinton and Vice President Biden campaigned today in Biden's hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania. Biden said Donald Trump doesn't care about the middle class. He added no party nominee has been less prepared on national security and foreign policy than Trump. An airstrike hit a hospital supported by Doctors Without Borders in northern Yemen today. The New York Times reports at least 15 people were killed, dozens more wounded. A fast-moving wildfire in California, one of several burning in the state, has spread to more than 6 square miles. Officials say the blaze has destroyed at least 100 homes in the Lower Lake area, about 90 miles north of San Francisco. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. Bloomberg West is next.
And this is Bloomberg West. Coming up, putting startup valuations to the test. Dropbox meets advisors to discuss an IPO. Is the company ready? We will discuss. Plus, he is one of the biggest names in European VC, Atomico CEO and Skype founder Nicholas Zenstrom, on why he sees lots more M&A in the pipeline. And the security firm at the heart of one of the most complicated and controversial political hacks of all time. An exclusive conversation with CrowdStrike, the company that first pointed the finger at Russia. First to our lead. Dropbox is considering making the big leap into the public markets. Executives met with advisors to discuss the possibility of going public as soon as 2017. This according to people familiar with the matter who say the file storage company wanted to discuss the feasibility of a listing and get a sense of the valuation it could fetch from investors. That's a concern for any company, but especially so with Dropbox. Remember, just 2 years ago, the company was anointed a decacorn valued at $10 billion in a private funding round. Joining us now to discuss, Rajesh Ram, co-founder of the cloud company Ignite and a Dropbox competitor. And in New York, we've got our Bloomberg IPO reporter, Alex Barinka, who broke this story. And of course, Alex, some investors have questioned that valuation. Dropbox has faced write-downs from various investment firms. What exactly do you know about the discussions that they have had?
The valuation is going to be kind of top of mind here when it comes to whether or not they want to move forward. Basically, management brought advisors in to say, okay, if we did do this in 2017, what would this look like and what would public market investors want to give us? And you have to remember, Emily, with the backdrop of IPOs this year, we've seen kind of a pullback in how much investors are willing to give these companies when it comes to valuation. If the company's not profitable, if they don't have a clear path to getting there, these are all things that have